thank you, Dr. Adam Nichol. Adam is the Assistant Professor in Sport Development Management and Coaching at Northumbria University. His research seeks to support sports workers and practitioners to bring about positive influence in their own and others' well-being, social development and performance. Adam has embarked on a collaborative project with Manchester City FC called City in the Community, which critically investigated and supported the practice of community sports coaches in implementing key policy objectives and works with British cycling and UK coaching on funded research. Adam has also a collaborator with the FA and has been funded by the UEFA to present internationally to 55 member football associations and has influenced national sport and policy regarding recruitment, training, development and retention. He advocates for the power of sport, and his work has involved campaigns to prevent the closure of local leisure facilities, resulting in, I think it's amazing, in the build of a new £20 million sports centre. Adam is also active National League football match official, cricket coach, coach educator, and referee. And somehow, Adam, you've managed to also write this journal with Dr. David Elder-Vass and Dr. Catherine Hastings, and I don't know how you've quite done it, but good evening, Adam, and welcome to our group. Lovely to hear from you.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks for the welcome.
Yeah, so could you please sort of take us on your, I've been reading it again today, putting philosophy to work, developing the conceptual architecture research projects. I think it's an excellent journal. I think as a PhD researcher in my final year, I wish I could have cited this 2 years ago. It would save a lot of work. And I think as a group, when we're looking at applying CR, this really is quite an important and critical journal that you and Dave and Catherine have written.
Well, thanks very much, Mark, and yeah, a huge thanks for the invite. Everybody really looking forward to the session today. The way I haven't got any real slides as such, I thought I'd prepare maybe a 10-15 minute talk around the paper itself, and then hopefully encourage lots of dialogue and debate, questions throughout the remainder of the session. So hopefully that's okay. In terms of the article itself, just a starting point really, I suppose, in where it all began. So Dave Elder-Vass was my external examiner for the PhD, and we had a conversation on the back of the Viva really about how we could write something that brought this to life a little bit in the application of CR within multiple different domains or disciplines. So the paper really, we know that there's a growing body of work on applications of critical realism within empirical research. And often I think what those accounts are really good at is perhaps presenting connections between what we've called in the framework, which I'll come on to later in the session, connections between one or two key components at a time. So it might be the key philosophical principles of critical realism, how that then informs methodology or method, for example, how ontology informs the theory that is used and the empirical evidence. So what we've noticed from the literature was that largely a big number of those studies had focused on one connection or two connections at a time. So what we wanted to do really was pull together a more holistic and kind of coherent conceptual framework really, which could be used as a tool to think with and reflect upon. So the model that we've promoted really isn't something that is a golden bullet approach, which will solve all projects or will kind of, I suppose, solve all issues. We really present it as a set of tools to think with and reflect upon that will apply to different contexts, different research projects. So that was the starting point, really, I suppose, to create this more holistic framework. And just to go into a bit of the story behind my own work and where that came from and how that will then help me to, I suppose, talk through an example and work through the model itself. So my research, my PhD was largely looking at the influence of coach behavior. So how do sport coaches influence athletes that they are working with and vice versa. And originally it started off, my undergraduate degree was in applied sports science with coaching. So very kind of positivist in the underpinnings of that undergraduate program, and therefore the PhD at the offset set out to be a very positivist informed project. So it was going to be, I suppose, looking at certain athlete outcomes, that might be GPS and heart rate kind of data, and then observing coach behavior and almost creating a numeric output, if you like, to try and correlate those behaviours with particular outcomes that athletes, how the coaches were influencing those athletes. And then when I started to do a literature review and a systematic review, which was the first study really, I started to find lots of these studies which were correlational or cross-sectional in nature, which told us a lot about the what. So which specific behaviours from a sport coach's point of view were linked to certain athlete outcomes. What we didn't know a lot about, I suppose, from the literature was the how, when, why, or under which circumstances those behaviours really impacted athletes, or in some cases did not impact athletes or various other stakeholders in the coaching fraternity. So the paper then became really a critical realist critique, I suppose, as well as a systematic review. It was then ended off being a critical realist critique because I had some unease, some level of discomfort with the literature that I'd come across previously. And I thought, for me, that's not how coaching works. For me, it was much more emergent, it was much more complex and multiply determined. So I started to look into other different areas and other philosophical perspectives, one of which was pragmatism, constructionism, interpretivism, which is kind of a big philosophical position within the coaching literature, and then also critical realism. And I found that critical realism for me really resonated with my beliefs about coaching, the ontology of coaching, if you like, this complex depth ontology with multiple layers and multiply determined phenomena where entities are have emergent properties, if you like. I know Dave was doing a talk at a previous session which he'd held, and I really like this notion of emergence, that entities have properties on their lower level parts. So how they are made up, for example, if a torch wasn't organized into a certain set of parts at a lower level, then it wouldn't have the capacity to shine a light. Whereas just as equally in a coaching context, there may be social structures made up of individuals which then possess a causal property to create a norm and a tendency for others to perhaps follow that norm alongside agency as well, of course. So I think that was really where the project had come from, and how, for me, critical realism really benefited me in that process. Now I'm going to pull up just briefly and share my screen now for a moment. Hopefully you can see this okay. This is the framework that we've come up with through the paper itself. And again, as I said earlier, we're not proposing this as a kind of catch-all solution to problems that researchers might face, I suppose, in realist spheres. What we are hopefully presenting is a coherent and a holistic model which allows researchers to think through their research projects in a critical manner. And again, lots of the previous literature, the lots of valuable studies which have contributed to the literature have tended to look at the connections in the downward arrows. So what we've labeled here as the informing arrows. And some work has started to look at the validating or the challenge to these various different components. And of course, we recognize that within each of these components, there are multiple other areas that we could have focused upon. But inevitably, the model has to be presented in a particular way and will perhaps miss things. So we encourage other researchers. It might be ethics, for example, that we are thinking about in some of these areas. So we encourage it as a flexible model where it can be used as a springboard or a starting point, really. But what we're advocating is that researchers within their projects can almost start at any point within the framework or the model and make various connections back and forth. So for me, the story and the narrative which I talked through earlier looked largely at how, for me, that the philosophical principles, when I started to look through some of the methodologies, the methods, the empirical research in that review paper at an early point, something for me didn't sit well in terms of how those studies perhaps presented certain things, how they presented influence or presented various ways of looking at coach behavior. While it told us lots of important information about the what, perhaps it didn't tell us as much about the who, when, why, or under which circumstances. So for me, there was a disconnect, really. And at the other levels of the model, that then prompted some thought. And when I did go off and look at critical realism, that then for me informed for my project, which methodology was I going to draw upon. So in this case, it was looking at, for me, in line with the principles, the key tenets of critical realism, to look at things in a complex manner, with emergence and a laminated ontology, was to look really at, for the influence of coach behaviour, I felt that we needed a longitudinal approach, which drew upon participant observation. It was an ethnography in essence, so drew upon semi-structured interviews, participant observation, and stimulated recall interviews, which are essentially where you film, for me it was filming segments of matches and filming segments of training sessions and showing those back to the participants who were coaches and athletes to say from the coach's point of view, what were you trying to do with that practice or that behaviour? What did you want to achieve? And then from the athlete's point of view, how did you perceive that? And what was really interesting was that often the responses from the athletes would be very different to what the coach had intended their practice to do or to bring about with that influence. In some cases, there was non-influence where the athletes, for whatever reason, weren't influenced, perhaps didn't hear what was said because they were focusing on reflecting on their performance in the moment, or sometimes it brought about an unintended influence. So it had a different influence for multiple individuals, really. So for me, that the approach, the methodology, I suppose, then informed the methods, which in turn informed the empirical research. And what we've done in the paper really is to present a set of 3 examples. So myself, Dave Elder-Vass and Catherine Hastings have presented 3 elements of the model, one looking more at the top of the model, one looking more down the left-hand side, and the other looking more down the right-hand side of the model. And we bring that to life by drawing upon previous literature in critical realist spheres, as well as drawing upon our own research projects to try and bring some of this to life and to say, well, actually, what does this look like if we dig underneath the surface of a critical realist project and look at all of the thought that goes on behind that, the critical discussions, debates, and internal debates that we have in order to make decisions related to our projects. And I think this is often hidden from lots of the published work that we see. We see lots of excellent critical realist work published, but often for whatever reason, it might be journal article word limits, for example. But we often don't see a lot of this messiness, if you like, that sits behind research projects. So what we wanted to do with this paper was really bring that to the fore and almost look at what does this look like in a project to hopefully support other researchers, perhaps particularly ECRs, but also those at all stages of engaging with critical realism, to prompt them and to perhaps stimulate some thought to develop the quality, rigor and richness of their work. We've kind of looked at those 3. That the reason we've drawn upon our work was clearly because we knew that better than the other literature, and were perhaps then able to draw upon some more tangible examples from those studies and those projects than if we'd perhaps drawn on other literature that is already published. So I suppose in essence, we hope that it's a holistic framework and a set of tools to really think with or reflect upon, rather than a clear recipe of how to do something. And as well as this, I suppose I'll just stop sharing for now and come back to a few key points which the model and the paper prompted us to think about as a set of co-authors. One of those was, how do those from different philosophical positions work together? And I know Mark and I were having a chat just before the call earlier. Is that something that is kind of possible? And I know certainly for me, I do a lot of work with constructionists and interpretivists as well. And at first I felt the level of kind of unease about, I was positioned as a critical realist. I'd done my PhD in critical realism, and then thought, is it okay to work, when papers are being published, if that is more from an interpretivist constructionist position, how does that sit? So for example, the referee dropout work that we've done previously, looking at why do so many football referees drop out of the game, was it okay that was largely a constructionist interpretivist project with critical realist principles kind of built in? And for me, I think Dave Elder-Vass's work on the similarities and the ability to connect, I suppose, critical realism, realist ontology, and moderate social constructionism, the compatibility of those 2 elements, really I find to be an excellent piece, and to really support the work which I'm doing. So I see a lot more convergences. I think often these philosophical positions, realism, interpretivism, constructionism, can at times be positioned in these almost methods textbooks in a crisply distinct table with different categories. What really interests me is how can we look at the overlaps? Yes, there may be some clear differences between those philosophical positions, between positivism and critical realism, for example. but can we also look at the overlaps? If we think of them almost as a Venn diagram, what are those bits in the middle where we can work together in those fruitful areas, and look at how actually these principles can work together? For example, how do we need both realist ontology as well as social constructionism? So constructionism in the sense that we as humans create things over time. We might create particular cultures, discourses, but clearly those have a material impact on opportunities, experiences, and so on. So there may be certain things which exist more independently to us. If we're looking at, planetary movement, for example, then clearly that is different to if we're looking at a very discursive topic that then has both, in my view, a realist ontology, but also is heavily influenced by social constructionism. So again, working through this framework and bringing this to life in different projects prompted these types of questions, not just from a realist position. So we hope that the framework may be more beneficial, not only beneficial for those working within critical realism, but also those working from different philosophical positions, and perhaps how those from different positions may work together. And again, this, I suppose, prompts a really interesting point on the role of supervisors. And I was really fortunate in my PhD that my supervisors were open to me going off and exploring these different philosophical positions. So exploring some of these differences between areas of the framework at an early stage. It would have been quite easy for my supervisors to say, well, you're doing this project, so you're an interpretivist researcher, for example, or a constructionist. But I think for me to have that freedom and really be able to go off and explore these different philosophical positions that underpin my research was really beneficial and enabled me to know more about the philosophy and how it was applied in the specific context of sport coaching work or officiating work and the sociology of sport, if you like. So on my supervisory team, I had both constructionists, interpretivists, and positivists as well. So physiologists on the team, as well as coaching researchers, sociology of sport researchers. And for me, that really helped to check and challenge my understanding of critical realism, which is still developing. I think it's inherently built in to critical realism that this concept of fallibility, that we don't ever 100% crack something. We're moving towards better understanding and see our better causal explanation of phenomena and mechanisms that are underpinning what we are seeking to explain. But to have that almost be in the middle and at some point being kind of pulled between different perspectives, to be asked those critical questions was really beneficial for me to know more about realism and how that informed the project. And I suppose linked to that, on the right-hand side of the model there, we've got social ontology and theory, which again was a really interesting aspect for me in my project, thinking about what does this look like? What makes my project explicitly critical realist versus something else? And again, those philosophical principles at the top of the model, working down to social ontology. So what must social entities be like, for example? What must social structures be like in order for us to understand them? And again, in my research, I've drawn upon the work of Dave Elder-Vass around norm circles and around social structures, that the causal power of social structures as being an emergent property. So I mentioned earlier how these cultures may be constructed over time by us, and interactions that we have in society or particular groups will create some of these norms. And these norm circles, Dave Elder-Vass would argue, are social structures which have the capacity to causally influence our behavior at an individual level, to store dispositions within our neural networks, if you like, that then inform our action. But importantly, we also have this capacity for agency, which together plays a role alongside social structure in informing our actions. So the argument, I suppose, is that most, if not all, of our actions are informed by both social structure and the conscious reflexivity, or the capacity to think and the capacity to use agency to varying degrees. So I suppose that was, if you like, the social ontology. The theory of norm circles that I used was compatible with the social ontology, the position of an understanding of social structures and their causal powers alongside agency, which then fed into the empirical research. But importantly, I suppose that theory didn't dominate. It wasn't used as a shoehorn or a metaphorical hammer to put the data into, if you like, into categories. It was really important that back and forth, that the different arrows that I mentioned earlier, both informing and validating and challenging theory, was really important for me, I think, and enabling that process of challenge at all levels of the model, rather than seeing it as just a linear kind of model where one stage crisply and nicely linearly informs the next stage, if you like. So for us, it's a constant iteration between various aspects of the model, and down to some bits of even recognizing my own role as a researcher, as a somebody who was doing these observations within a squad for 12 months, recognizing how did my role as a researcher shape the data which I was generating. How were the players aware of me and my role, and what I was doing? You know, as I was taking field notes in the field, how were players perceiving that? Did they think that for me as a researcher, that I was then feeding back to the coach about selection, for example? Or was it perhaps more beneficial to take field notes on a phone, as if I was just texting, perhaps? And that was seen as a different, in a different way in terms of my role as a researcher. So some of these things at a practical level, even in the model, in terms of how those methods are deployed, and what impact that has on the empirical research which is generated, is another one of those connections in the model. And I suppose finally, just to touch upon this idea of emancipation and impact, I think inherent within critical realism is this ability to make positive change in the world, to have a positive impact. So how can we bring about emancipatory outcomes and impact? And I think for me, critical realism offers a really valuable set of tools to do that. Enables us to look at things in complex ways, which then in turn supports us to make perhaps recommendations to look at the generalizability of our work. And again, rather than saying that something is going to be crisply and perfectly applied into all contexts, is having that sense of this might be a tool to think with. So we've generated these findings in this particular context, but actually can we apply, reflect or refine upon some of those in terms of how they can be utilized in different contexts. So the example of the football officials study I mentioned earlier, often that is put down to abuse. The abuse that officials experience leads in a causal manner to dropout. And what we found in our study was that, yes, that was clearly part of the mechanism, if you like, but it was also other aspects. So it was to do with the way in which disciplinary hearings, for example, were managed, the way in which officials were appointed, their training experiences, and their interactions on a match day with spectators, with coaches, with players, and often they felt as if they were an out-group. They felt that they were receiving these negative interactions often, and then if there wasn't support on the back of that, then these things came together in a complex causal mechanism rather than being one sole factor. It was very different for each individual match official. So rather than just pinning it down to this one fact that had a causal linear impact, it was looking at the more complex causal mechanisms, if you like, that sat behind official dropout, which then had the potential to inform policy and practice, and inform the support that it was then provided, as opposed for officials moving forwards from that. So I think I'll pause at that point. Hopefully that's been useful, just as a bit of a guide to talk through the paper, where it had come from, and what our ideas and thinking kind of were behind the paper. So thank you very much for listening. Of course, I'm happy to take questions as well.
Thank you, Alan. Really useful. I mean, one of the sort of take homes I had, because when you're researching that there is an open system, is messy. You're going to hit I would be surprised if you don't hit tensions, contradictions, etc. So actually to have that to refer back to, that makes that okay, and you can understand that. The one thing, I'll put a cheeky question before I open up to the rest. The one thing I suppose that had an initial query, what was the definition of a meta question? I obviously had the kind of the 5 bubbles, but I suppose especially if you were new to CR, that would be quite nice to be defined. Could you define that a little? Is that okay?
Yeah, of course. Did you say a meta question? Sorry.
Yeah. So obviously meta questions used throughout the journal, but I couldn't see a kind of clear cut definition of what that was meant, and I did a bit of a Google. That went off on a very different tangent. So it'd be great, especially for people watching like the YouTube version of this, just so they might not even be to CR, just so we can sort of nail that little bit down.
Yeah, of course. I think for me, a meta question is something to do with particularly the upper layers of the model. So things like philosophical principles, how that informs social ontology and methodology. and some of those wrestles or those critical thoughts that we have about philosophy, for example, the philosophical tenets. It might be the example I mentioned earlier, that for me, something didn't quite sit right in terms of when I looked at the previous literature on the topic that I was exploring. For me, this more causal kind of linear view of coaching behavior impact and outcomes in more correlational cross-sectional studies, while it was useful in telling us some information on the what, didn't necessarily tell us a lot about when, why, for whom, under which circumstances. So I think that was an example of a meta question where we are really forced, if you like, through our engagements, perhaps with literature, perhaps with different philosophical positions, to think about our own stance on something, or to change, perhaps if we're using a theory, for example, and we're explaining some data using that theory or a different set of theories, and we experience some challenge, our data doesn't quite confirm or validate, it presents some challenge to that theory. That would again be an example of a meta question where it's forcing us to think cognitively and critically about, well, actually, why does that not match? Does the theory need to be refined? Or perhaps are there other theories that might help us to explain the phenomenon that we are interested in? And again, of interest, I suppose, for me, that doesn't need to explicitly be critical realist theory. It can be theory from other domains or disciplines that helps us with that multiply determined causal explanation of the phenomena that we're interested in. So I suppose a meta question ultimately is just something that forces us through those connections between various components in the model, whether that's informing in a downward arrow or validating or challenging in more of an upward arrow, is that dialogue and that process that we have. It could be with colleagues or it could be internally ourselves, those critical questions that we have that force us to be almost reflexive on our own stance or our own position.
Thank you. Nice, that's a great answer. Thank you. Adam, you've got your hand up, sir.
Thanks. I mean, Adam, thank you ever so much for your presentation this evening and taking the time to come and talk to our network. It's really terrific to have people who come and talk about concrete applications of what can often appear to certainly to early career students, but even those late on in their careers as quite obtuse in the abstract. So I think addressing some of the values of critical realism at the level of the real concrete is really really useful. And I just thought in that vein then, perhaps with reference to your coaching research project, if we were to formulate a question like what would be what explains the causes of the pathways out of coaching? You mentioned the abuse and so on and so forth and the other factors. Okay, if we were to take that question, and you've spoken very eloquently about the benefits of complementing CR with constructionism in developing a more kind of nuanced response to that kind of etiology, that response to that kind of causal question. Yeah, but and you're right, Dave Elder-Vass did speak to the group previously, and I think a very interesting conversation we had with him was what might nonetheless distinguish critical realism from constructionism. Yeah, what might be the red lines between that, such that the distinction between critical realism and constructionism still needs to be made. Yeah, they can't be collapsed into one another. So at what point in your project in explaining the causes of coaches' routes out of coaching, would you say it ceased to be a constructionist or interpretivist piece of work per se, and became a realist one, which says, nonetheless, look, this is our commitment to advancing these causal explanations, and this is what it looks like, and this is why you need this, in addition to, admittedly, the benefits and the insights that neat or even mild constructionism can give you.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I think that's a brilliant question, and for me, I think often the two are positioned in very kind of umbrella type terms. So critical realism is often positioned as an umbrella term as well as constructionism. And for me, they're much more diverse as schools of thought than that. So even within critical realism, we have so many different perspectives now, as well as constructionism. So I think this umbrella term for each often sets up this view that they talk past one another. And often, for example, constructionism might critique critical realism and say, well, everything exists independently to us, and therefore nothing can be constructed. And vice versa, a critical realist approach might critique constructionism and say, well, everything is constructed in the mind, and nothing exists independent to us. And I don't think that's what either position or certainly for the vast majority of researchers within those positions, is trying to achieve. I think the overlaps, if you like, in between those two are so important, and often where we have this dialogue, this discussion to say, well, actually, how can the two support each other, then that is really important and fruitful. So for me, I think it was about looking in the coaching project. It was about looking at what were the way in which these cultures, these practices were created over time. So what were the norms, for example, that existed? And clearly those were dependent upon the interaction between members of the squad, the coaches, the athletes, for example, as well as broader sets of norms. And I think what was important was what Dave calls the intersectionality of norms or norm circles, that often in our decisions that are made, we're influenced normatively by a number of different cultures, a number of different norm circles that impact our behavior in the moment. And it's not always clear to make those links, because sometimes there are unconscious influences on our behavior. These dispositions are built up over time. So for example, the accents that we use, the language that we speak with, we might reproduce those largely unconsciously, but we always have this conscious agency or capacity to think and adapt those as well. So I think for me, the real benefit of drawing upon both approaches rather than an either or approach was to look at, for example, some of the time the norm might be that athletes should listen to the coach and should adopt whatever the strategy that the coach is advocating. When in actual practice, what we saw was that in some cases, the intended influence of practice was brought about, but in other cases, athletes used their agency. And despite being asked to play a particular role, they went off and performed in their own way, if you like. So one of the batters in one of the games in a cricket context was asked to play more defensively. And the norm circle around that might have been that actually you should listen to the coach and you should adopt this more defensive strategy. Now, for the athlete himself, he'd chosen to play an attacking shot to kind of try and hit the ball out of the ground, successfully hit a 6, which was successful performance in that context. And interestingly, when I had this discussion with the coach wasn't too concerned that he'd almost gone against the norm, if you like. He'd used his agency because the outcome was still productive for the overall team. So I think this interesting notion of the intersectionality of norms, how we use our agency to navigate these norms, and whether or not those are perceived to be violations of norms or deviance, if you like, was a really interesting one that allowed me to look at, through an emergentist theory of action, both structure and agency together. So both constructionism, where these norms had come from, how they'd been developed, and what these structural influences were, but also how constructionism, how realism also helped us to play a role in that. What was the agency that individuals were drawn upon to also inform their action? In another example, which is quite unexpected actually, one of the coaches praised some performance of a wicketkeeper who had taken a one-handed catch and stumped the batsman out, which was really desirable performance in that context. So the coach had praised and had clapped loudly from one side of the hall in an indoor session during the winter. And in a recall interview, I asked the coach, I said, what was your intention behind doing that, behind praising the specific player? And he said it was to increase motivation levels, to almost set the norm that was expected performance from the other players. And in actual fact, when I showed the same footage back to the same player in a recall interview, so showed him the video footage, before I'd even asked the question, he said, oh, I didn't even hear the coach say that. I was just so caught up in the moment, the kind of ringing in my ears with the reflecting on the fact I'd done really well with my performance. There's almost this, to highlight the complexity, and to come back to your point around constructionism and realism, it was to highlight this complexity that although the coach thought it brought about a particular impact, in actual fact, it had a non-influence, if you like, for that particular player. But that's not to say for others who were around that they didn't hear and weren't influenced by that same coach behavior. So what I'm really interested in, I suppose, is how, from a CR, an emergentist, and a complex, multiply determined point of view, how did that behavior also influence the bowler or the batter or others who were around who listened to that perspective? So I suppose it's to do with both how we create these norms, how we construct them, but also how those have a realist ontology, how they have a real causal impact on what we are doing. I don't know if that helps at all.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you get that towards the end there. That last point is absolutely, maybe Nick come in on this point, and he shares this interest with us. Causal mechanisms, seems to me, and the courage to commit to those rather than fall back into forms of relativism can so often accompany interpretivist arguments. Well, it meant this to this player or this coach or that to this other sort of coach or this other team, and there are these plethora of interpretations of what constitutes effective coaching or performance, etc., etc. But looking at across the piece of this, we think you can substantiate this idea that such and such abuse sometimes is a causal mechanism for leading to pathways out of coaching when it is configured with these other causal mechanisms in particular context. So that which seems to me is what would distinguish a realist account as such from a straightforward interpretivist account. Yeah. So I think it's the notion of causal mechanisms and committing to our etiology, I guess, is the point. Is there, are you a member of a club type question?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that actually perhaps those causal mechanisms are the thing that might help us as realists, as critical realists, to distinguish what we do. But equally, I think there are, from working with constructionists and collaborating closely with constructionists, I do think there are a lot of constructionists who are perhaps maybe doing that without using the language of causal mechanisms and creating very complex explanations of phenomena, social phenomena, and perhaps drawing upon realist ontology implicitly. And I think that's where some of these connections between individuals working in different philosophical positions, or even those within positions drawn upon different principles, rather than viewing them as one distinct box or category which can't overlap into another, I think for me is the real benefit of seeing the convergences, if you like, between them. But yeah, thanks very much for the question. Really interesting.
Thank you.
Nichol, you've had your hand raised for a little while. So.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Thanks, Adam, for the presentation. Really clear and concise overview. I thought of the kind of process of developing a conceptual architecture, which was really beneficial. And I noted your observation about some of the restrictions of journals and publications in terms of how much detail you can include in terms of your account of conceptualization, and that's something we all face, in that often when we present our research in publications, we've already arrived at a coherent conceptual framework, right, on the basis of the research and the analysis that we've carried out, and been through that adaptive process of theory building as well. And that kind of create a question for me in terms of what more can we do as critical realist researchers in terms of improving the transparency of the research process. And if we look elsewhere to scholars, academics who perhaps pursue a more confirmatory or hypothesis testing type of research, we see the pre-registration now of research designs, concepts, ideas, with a view to then increasing the process of creating a more transparent process as part of the research process. So is there a case, for instance, or an argument to be made for us as critical realist researchers perhaps to pre-register our conceptual frameworks on the back of that initial process of abstraction, based on what we already know from the literature, and then revisiting that post-publication of our research to see how things changed over time and how that process unfolded as well? So I'm just keen to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. I think, again, a really interesting point. And I think for me, it would be about creating those spaces where we can have those discussions. And a lot of it does go on, but especially I remember for me as a PhD student, I really struggled with a lot of these issues, and I was trying to get my head around critical realism and thinking, well, how do I actually, where are my go-to sources? And there were a lot of really valuable sources, books and journal articles. And sometimes I think that level of discomfort is almost necessary to work your way through critical realism and become conversant with it. I don't think we ever, as I say, reach an end point, but I think although it feels uncomfortable in the moment, it does help you in the longer term to then, when you work through and resolve some of those issues, those meta questions that we came back to earlier, it helps you to really get to know your area. As you mentioned, a really good point that it's almost inevitable we don't have enough room as we would like to talk through how we've achieved or how we've reached some of these points in a journal article. So I wonder if some of the ways in which we can support PGRs, ECRs, but all researchers, is to have these spaces, as you say. Is that through a pre-registration, perhaps a journal submission or something which is reviewed before it's then kind of formally accepted, if you like, and to feed back on that from a realist perspective, a critical realist perspective, or is it to have those spaces? And I think that's why these groups are so important for me, is because they allow the space and time to think through some of these projects. We run a similar, Jack Newman and I run a similar critical realist discussion group as well. And I always find it really beneficial that somebody comes in and almost presents a problem and says, this is what I'm struggling with. I really can't grasp this in my critical realist project. And just the ability to draw upon those, even in completely different fields, I think really creates a sense of support, but also be a constructive challenge to say, well, actually, you know, how have we reached these points? And here's how I've perhaps navigated some of these issues in the past myself. So I think whether it be conference presentations, these types of groups, perhaps it is pre-reg type reviews that can support. But I think it's about finding and almost in some cases not being shy to go and speak to some of those in critical realism as well. Certainly everybody I've come across is very open to having those discussions and saying kind of how they've navigated certain things. It's a very welcoming community, I think, for me, that the critical realist community. So it's about kind of initiating those discussions, and equally as supervisors, as supporters, is about being open and supporting, if you like, the next generation of critical realist scholars, because I do think it's a hugely growing community now, which is excellent to see. So these spaces, these types of fora to have these discussions, I think are incredibly valuable.
Thank you. Has anybody else got a question? I know, Fidelis, did you have your hand up for a little while? Fidelis, you there?
Yes. Yeah, I don't know. I think my question was more related to the complexity, the issue of complexity, which Adam research is touching on. And also, I think, so my question on that is actually to do with coaching, because he's talking about coaching. So then I think in the tech industry, they also adopted the idea of coaching into the, for example, agile coaching, and which is exactly what agile is trying to manage, those complexity. So because they borrowed the idea from sports, which I know your work is based on, I wonder whether you really clarify it, what the coaching and how that complexity actually is helped either by social constructionists or critical realism was best in specifying the differences in that. So that's basically what I was thinking.
That was, again, a great question. And I do think there are certainly overlaps and similarities with coaching in a range of different fields and disciplines. I think for me, the real benefit of critical realism, and as you mentioned, realist ontology and moderate social constructionism, was that it enabled me to look at coaching in much more complex ways. So it enabled me to understand in my study on social influence, what did that influence look like for different individuals. I think typically it had been conceptualized because of those cross-sectional correlational studies, in quite a linear, simplistic, rationalistic type way. Whereas actually what CR enabled me to do was to look at that in much more complex manner and say, well, actually, when this behavior is delivered, for example, from a coach, looking at that from a relational point of view, and actually how is that interpreted by different individuals. So for me, it was about drawing upon Dave Elder-Vass's theory of norm circles and an emergentist theory of action, that the social structure and agency interactions that brought about particular forms of influence. And rather than viewing it as, it actually changed my coaching practice. So I coach in cricket and also coach match officials in football as well. And it changed the way that I thought about my own coaching. So I used to, if you like, view coaching as, well, I've delivered a behavior. It might be that I've seen an athlete or a participant do something really well. I deliver some praise or some feedback on the back of that and almost hope it has a particular impact. I might assume because somebody smiles that it has had a particular influence. But actually that example I referred to earlier, where the player hadn't heard the practice at all, made me think about, well, actually, how am I more almost politically astute as a coach and aware of the social influence that I can bring about for different individuals? And how can that one behavior be interpreted very differently by a number of individuals? So another example from the research was where the coach had delivered a behavior to one or two batters who were in the middle of the pitch. So it shouted quite a distance some feedback to the players in the middle. And again, when I was walking around the field with the coach during the day and taking some field notes, I just asked him, I said, well, what was your intention behind that? And he said, well, it was to impact the way in which the two batters in the middle were playing. And I actually then interviewed some of the players who were sitting on the sidelines waiting to go in to bat next. And for them, when I interviewed them, they said, well, actually, it had an impact for me. It told me not to play a particular way, not to play those shots, because that wasn't the normative expectation at the time. So the structural influence in terms of the norms for those players about what should or shouldn't be done, it enabled me to understand this kind of phenomena of coaching and social influence in much more complex ways than perhaps looking at it in a more linear, rationalistic kind of view. So I think, yeah, it informed both the methods which I was using to then draw upon a range of methods. So the participant observation, stimulated recall, and semi-structured interviews with the players and coaches, but also to look at it from multiple perspectives rather than just almost taken for granted that we do these things as coaches and it has a particular impact on these players, to look in much more complex and critical ways about what is this social influence that is brought about. So I think for me, without CR, I wouldn't have been able to investigate coaching in as complex a manner or as emergent a manner as was possible.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. Adam, just one question for me. With your research, did you struggle, or how did you attain to go, you know, because what you're speaking with the coach, and that, you know, you've interviewed that person, you're illuminating that person's internal conversation in a kind of archer way. How did you manage to attain to the real, you know, from you know, not just empirically? Yeah. How did you get to those mechanisms, you know, that are unseen, which I think seems to be the trickiest part for me, for CR? Yeah,
absolutely, Mark. I think that's another great question, and it's almost, when we position, I know there's been some debate around the three domains of reality: the real, the actual, and the empirical. But I think it is a really nice distinction in some ways conceptually for us to think about, well, actually, there are these things that are happening underneath the surface, if you will, so that how do we understand what is going on underneath the surface and those complex causal mechanisms? So you're right that a lot of the interview-based data which I generated, the participant observation data, gave me understanding at the level of the empirical, perhaps what were the events that were occurring. But then I think part of how I got to those causal mechanisms for me was about how did I engage with theory? So how did I draw upon that theory and its coherence with social ontology to understand what was happening? So it was a case of, well, actually, how are these mechanisms being explained by the interaction of causal norm circles, social structures, and agency that the athletes or the coach themselves were drawn upon. So I think for me, it's about the process of identifying those causal mechanisms can be supported by the empirical data that we generate, but is also about us as researchers perhaps having conversations with critical friends or engaging with theory that we might draw upon. And we all have pre-theoretical dispositions. I think inevitably, whether we like it or not, we bring certain theories that we might like to what we see in projects or what we see in everyday life. So for me, it's about drawing upon those, but not using those as the only things which dominate what we see. It's about having that reflexivity and that ability to have discussions with those who operate in other theoretical positions or even other philosophical positions or paradigms to say, well, actually, you know, how might this also help to explain the causal mechanisms which are underpinning the phenomena that we are trying to explain? And I think you touched upon a really important point here, that the framework that we present, often whether researchers are aware about it or not, they will be making these connections, going through these meta questions about their projects. The way in which they design their methods or their methodology will clearly be informed by their philosophical principles or their view of social ontology, for example. It might be that we're not consciously aware of that in the moment, but whatever decision we make is underpinned by, you know, we might have been educated in that way, that positivist schools of thought about, you know, creating power calculations for sample sizes and so on, that is inevitably attached to a certain set of philosophical principles. So I think whether we know about it or not, we make these decisions, and what the framework hopefully does is act as a bit of a stimulus to bring this to the fore a little bit and make it more explicit, the decisions that we are making, these connections between various components of the model and how they are coherent, or perhaps equally as important, if they are not connected to one another, if there are disconnections between elements of the model, why is that the case? And that's the bit I find really interesting, is where that often opens up the doors for change. If there are these disconnections between elements of the model, that really forces us to think about those meta questions and how we might want to change. I think there's less perhaps scope for change, or we tend to see less change at the top of the model. So the philosophical principles, the ontology, and the methodology, perhaps we tend to see less of a wholesale change in there, unless, my example earlier, when I started to review the literature and thought, this over time, this doesn't sit well with me. I perhaps need to look at another philosophical position, or draw upon multiple philosophical tenets. But I think for me, that is a really interesting bit, is where do these disconnections occur? Can we make those explicit? And in our research, can we almost celebrate those and say, well, this is how I've reached the point in which I have, rather than almost trying to, I've seen some projects in the past where often it's left till the very end. These decisions will have been made unconsciously. And then somebody might come and say, well, actually, which philosophical position do you sit within? For example, when it's getting close to a viva or writing into the thesis, and then it's often added as a section towards the end. And I think where we can do that up front and think through these things explicitly, and do that more throughout the project. Of course, it's not something which is just set and is then stable. It's something that is continually developing and evolving for everybody. So it's almost documenting these changes that occur, I think.
So, I mean, that'll be an obviation of any framework, especially from a CL point of view, which you're now putting that framework in. Actually leads back to Nick's question, because it adds that transparency. You're saying it's an open system. It has been messy. There have been contradictions and tensions, but actually this is how I resolve them, and I've used this. So actually, going back to Nick's question, that kind of builds on that transparency.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that the way we position it in the paper is almost the messiness that sits behind is foundational to many of these research projects, but often that isn't discussed or isn't brought to the fore. We do a lot of this thing, and then it's presented in this nice clean picture, if you like, at the end of a project, the way in which you publish, and that's inevitable. That's part of the norms and the norm circles that exist around how we get published, perhaps. Yeah. But I think it's really important, and for me, that the PhD process really enabled me to think critically about some of these things and how all of this sat together, as well as my continual development understanding currently now, that it's never something which is fixed and is set. The discussions I'm having with constructionists, with those within different critical realist positions and spheres, really help to enhance that diversity of discussion and that debate.
Thank you, Adam. Has anybody else got any other questions? No. Okay. Well, oh yeah, Fidelis, you just raised your hand. Go ahead.
Yes, Adam, I think what I wanted to probe a bit further with the question I asked earlier, but then when you mentioned that sometimes social constructionists and critical realism is more of like the dialogue that they're having, I'm kind of like thinking, so in your research, how did you deal with the sample frame, for example? Because critical realism may say that, well, social construction may come out with a sample size, for example, which they completely will not agree with the sample size, because how do you deal with human beings? Let's say if I'm researching an organization, I'm interested in the top and the middle, but in the field, I might not even get those in the middle, but I will still be able to manage the research, either the top managers or the lower managers or workers. So how do you come out with that sample size, bringing the two thinking together? That's the first question. I think the last question that I was actually thinking in terms of the complexity element there, more, are you seeing it more also that your phenomena is driven by the context? Because coming from the pragmatics view of things, are you thinking in that sense that even though it's complex, but context matters in that situation, or how are you seeing it? That's the way on.
Thanks, Fidelis. I think two great questions there. On the sample size of the recruitment, I like the work of Davies in that area, who draws upon almost, she calls it the choosing of cases rather than sampling, because I think sampling inherently has a term of kind of positivist notions built within that it were if you're sampling, then it sounds like random sampling approaches, where in critical realism, perhaps what we are interested in some of the time is choosing cases, perhaps. So we're interested in choosing a particular site or context because that has real benefit to our research questions and will enable us to look at something in real depth. So I don't think necessarily there is a straightforward or a clear formula for determining sampling or recruitment strategies. I think, again, it's in line with the framework that we've presented. It's almost about, for that specific set of questions, for that context, why are you choosing that approach, and how is that consistent with your principles? So for me, again, it was because critical realism, the philosophical principles, referred to this concept of emergence, of complexity, multiple determination, and the fact that these things are shaped by historical development. So the coaching that we saw wasn't just occurring in a vacuum, it was connected to previous interactions that occurred and also future interactions which may occur. So I think for me, that necessitated a need for longitudinal understanding. So in my sampling approach, it was necessary, therefore, to have more of an ethnography where I worked with one squad over a longer period of time, as opposed to potentially doing lots of perhaps random recruitment or sampling, where I tried to increase the sample size, if you like, that I was working with. I think for me, there is just as much benefit from looking at a small sample or a small case, and really getting to know that in rich depth, lots of critical insights from that one context. But just as equally, there may be benefits in other research questions of looking at a sampling strategy or a recruitment approach, which again looks at increasing, I suppose, the levels of recruitment, the numbers that we're looking to recruit. I know in Catherine's work, Catherine Hastings, who's a co-author on the paper, Catherine talks through her research in Australia on homelessness, and she has adopted a quantitative approach within her research. And again, that draws upon a different recruitment approach, a different sampling strategy, which is equally as coherent with critical realist principles and tenets. So I think for me, it's about, there isn't a kind of, as with most things in critical realism, there isn't necessarily one answer to all of those. Again, it's incredibly complex and dependent upon the research question. So it sounds like you mentioned earlier, it might be middle managers or in a hierarchical management structure that you were referring to. It might be that one organization or one case helps you to get some really rich information in line with your research questions, or equally, it could be that multiple cases and looking at the similarities and differences between those in the causal mechanisms might help as well. On your second point, thanks, Nick. On the second point around complexity, I think absolutely, I would say the context is absolutely critical. So I think looking at the context-dependent nature of what occurs within those settings, for me, within a coaching environment, yeah, it was absolutely critical to look at the multiply determined nature of what was going on. Does that answer your second question at all, Fidelis, as well?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Has anybody else got a question at all for Adam before we close up? No. Adam, I've really enjoyed tonight. It's been really informative. I've got a lot again from reading your journal today. I definitely will be citing it. And just thank you very much for your time. We'll get the YouTube video out, and other people can enjoy it and hopefully cite your work soon. All right, lovely. Have a great evening. Take care.
You too. Thanks very much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, everyone.